Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion on cultivating a sustainable tomorrow, building inclusive and resilient food systems. I want to start by thanking our sponsor, the Asian Development Bank, for making this panel discussion possible. And also thank you to all of you for joining us in person for this discussion today. My name is Pratima Singh. I'm a principal with the Policy and Insights team at Economist Impact, which is part of the Economist Group, and our panel discussion today is programmed by Economist Impact. The topic of our conversation today is really critical to our ability to sustain a resilient tomorrow. As the title says, we need to be building inclusive and sustainable food systems globally. The conversation today, through the conversation, we will explore the complexity, interconnectedness of the challenges that our global food system is facing, whether it's climate change, rising inequality and inequity, and of course, insufficient investment. Our focus will be really on what's needed to build food systems that are not only productive, because we do need to feed 10 billion globally by 2050, but also how our food systems can be sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. And we'll hear from our esteemed panelists on how to create partnerships, implement policy reforms, and scale innovation that can help us support farmers, protect natural capital, and of course, ensure food security for all. So with that, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists in this discussion today. Starting with the gentleman to my direct left, Mr. Krishnan Balendra, Chairman and Chief Executive, John Keells Holdings. We have Cleo Kawawaki, Director General, Sectors Department 2, Digital, Agriculture, Food, Nature and Rural Development, and Water and Urban Development sectors. We have Andrea Amato, Network Development Director from Slow Food, and Shengin Fan, Chair Professor, China Agricultural University and CGIAR Systems Board Member. Thank you very much to our panel for joining us today, and we're excited to have a very engaged and interesting discussion. So let's start with just understanding the context and the scale of the problem, and really focusing on what are some of those systemic risks and the true value of food. So our food systems, as I mentioned right up front, are entangled in different crises, whether it's biodiversity loss, inequality, and a lot of these challenges really are thought of in silos. So at the heart of this really is a mismatch between what's the true value of food and how are we really pricing and distributing and thinking about it. So to start and open the conversation, maybe Andrea, I could turn to you. I know you have an interesting story to share, but what do we get wrong when we focus specifically just on the cost of food rather than its social, ecological, cultural value?
First of all, thanks for the invitation to Asian Development Bank. I'm really happy to be here with you. If we talk about true cost of food and food, we have to start from farmers. And I'd like to share very quickly an experience that I had when I was maybe my first job at Slow Food was working with coffee producers in Latin America. And the first thing that struck me was that they were not aware of the cost of food production. They didn't know how much it cost the production of the coffee that they were trying to sell. And this was our first activity. They were not aware. Why? Because the market for them was the middleman that was just going there and buying the coffee from their farm. So first activity for us, but maybe also as a lesson learned for us that can be shared, is working with farmers in order for them to understand production cost and the value of food. To understand the value of food, what we did was to bring them closer to the market, closer to the consumer, seeing how the consumer were reacting to their food and how much they were paying their food, because for them was not clear that. So this is one of the first things that I'd like to share, how to calculate the cost and then have the consumers closer to the producers. Second, of course, if we zoom out, we have consumers approaching to food on a daily basis. We know that, like, for example, in Europe, 11% of the household costs are dedicated to food. That is much less than technology or other household costs. And that families have 18% of food waste of the food that they buy. So this also shows how much they value food, maybe not so much. When they look at the cost of food that they buy on a daily basis in a supermarket, they don't really understand all the implications of cheap food. As you were saying, implications on terms of production. But I would, just to make it easier, the implications are related to the health of the earth and health of the people. Health of the earth, 30% of greenhouse emissions are caused by food production. These should be calculated when we calculate the cost of food. And a figure to talk about health of the people, $175 billion annually of expenses in the US to treat obesity. This is related to food. Who is going to pay for this cost? This cost maybe should be distributed along the food chain and also in the price of the item itself.
That's a great note on who pays for the cost, and I know we want to talk about that. But speaking of finance, Cleo, can I bring you into this conversation as well on the systemic risks to just help us understand the context? Specifically, what are some of those significant risks that you're seeing in Asia related, whether it's to finance, to infrastructure, to trade, and how are development institutions adapting?
So this week, one of our biggest announcements was our ambition for 40 by 30, 40 billion investment in food system transformation by 2030. And that is trying to give one confidence that ADB is committed and that there will be finance available. And 27% of that will go to the private sector. So I hope you'll be looking at that as more. So the one thing that investors like in finance is, of course, certainty.
Yes.
And this has become a very uncertain world, right? In terms of like the system, I mean, the biggest challenge that we're facing is climate change. So how do we make the food systems transform into a climate resilient system? I mean, we can do that much more better, I mean, with regional cooperation. I mean, that's one of the monikers of ADB. So we're looking at that and looking at the risk from all of the sides of finance, as well as policy, as well as making the projects bankable with blended finance through that lens of regional cooperation and resiliency. And of course, the most important thing to people, you know, who's facing egg prices at $1 to $2, $3 a carton is the affordability.
Mm-hmm. Yes, affordability of egg went through the roof these past few months, and I know it's hurting a lot of individuals and households. Shangan, can I bring you into this conversation as well? We were talking about financing and the risks. I want to kind of ask you to take a macro perspective. What are some of those systemic risks, and how have they evolved in your opinion?
Yeah. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Food is in our culture, is in our DNA, that are coming from China. Over the last 5,000 years, civilization, every war, every change of government was related to food. So as Andrea said that, well, food is a big part of our society, big part of, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions and so on, or even overweight, obesity. But here I want to position food as an opportunity. It's not just a challenge. Yes, it is a challenge. It is a cost. It has lots of issues we need to fix. But it is an opportunity. The reason is, if you treat food as a system, not just food production, the value of the whole food system usually 3 or 4 times bigger than the production itself. The employment itself, sometimes 3 times bigger. Because it's not just production, the transportation, processing, even people who are working in restaurants, nutrition, health.
Yeah.
So yes, globally, the cost of food system is about $12 trillion. Yeah, that's the calculation from the Food System Economic Commission. But it is also an opportunity, so which also means that $12 billion financing opportunity. So if you have the right policy, right instrument, right incentives, huge opportunity for the private sector. So that's opportunity. But however, today, I think because of geopolitical struggles, conflicts, trade issues, just recently look at Pakistan and India, trade wars, obviously climate change. So our food system has become very vulnerable. Just give you some example. Because of recent changes, African food price probably will go up. And then smallholders' income will go down because their export opportunities will go down. So I'm afraid if we don't do something, if we don't invest enough, the $40 billion is a good start. I'm afraid in the next 2 or 3 years, we will see some setback of food and nutrition security globally. So that's why it's critical, so critical to discuss these important issues. Let's make sure that the progress we made during the last 20, 30 years will continue, keep that momentum.
Yeah. That's a good point on framing it as an opportunity and a challenge, and highlighting that obviously we have the ADB's commitment with 40 billion, and that's showing the multilateral commitment to this issue. Krishnan, may I bring you into this? We've talked about financing. Almost every participant has spoken on financing. I'd love to hear your perspective as the private sector representative on this. What do you see as the role of the private sector, of course, in managing this transition and understanding who's paying for it, and how are we putting this into practice?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd like to thank ADB for inviting me to join this panel. We've had a very long partnership with ADB. John Keels, for those of you who are not familiar, is a conglomerate in Sri Lanka, listed on the Colombo Stock Exchange. It's the largest market cap company on the stock exchange, and in many different businesses. Our main exposure to agriculture is on our supermarkets business. We have one of the largest supermarket chains in Sri Lanka, and we procure directly the fruits and vegetables from farmers. On the challenge going forward, and it has been a challenge for many decades, is that while the government is well-meaning, is looking at developing the best policies, the best regulations, providing infrastructure to farmers, educating farmers, it has really fallen on the private sector to get things done. And what we've seen over the last 2 decades is that as the supermarket, the modern retail business in Sri Lanka grew, our own chain and one of our competitors, there are really 2 large chains, is that the volume procured by the supermarkets directly from farmers grew significantly. And with that, you found the private sector stepping up where the government had missed out, and providing the support to the farmers to improve quality, improve availability, improve pricing. And we've done a lot of work with the ADB as well. ADB has been a stakeholder with us on this journey. And I mean, I can give many examples from the farm, where we are educating farmers on best practices, on climate resilience, the coffee example, on very basic farm budgeting. The financial literacy is minimal. On designing farms to have optimum production. But the farmer's journey doesn't just stop at the farm, because finally it matters to the farmer even what happens at the store. So from the point of the farmer leaving the farm and delivering to our collection center, we have 8 collection centers around Sri Lanka, how it is handled, how they used to bring their produce in gunny bags, which used to damage a lot of the crop. So educating them and providing support on using crates, on the right temperature They can't afford chiller trucks, of course, to bring it to our collection center, but just to manage the heat exposure to bring it to the collection center. Then at the collection center, cold storage and how we wash it and handle it. And from the collection center to our distribution center in Colombo, the transportation, the right transportation. And then at the store level, just another example, again, I'm just showing what the private sector has done, and it has translated to a better price, better certainty for the farmers, and therefore better funding capability for the farmers, even at the store level, to minimize wastage, which will enable us to give the farmer a better price, to have better inventory management. Right? So that we don't overorder and minimize, so that we can minimize our waste. So really, in a nutshell, it's the private sector that has had to step up in a big way. Still a long way to go, because modern retail only accounts for about 20% of grocery consumption in Sri Lanka. The rest is in the wet markets and the mom and pop stores. But you are finding more farmers benefiting from the private sector playing a bigger role.
That's a really great point, that the private sector has to step in to fill some of those gaps that we see in different markets and in different models. And speaking of models and maybe taking a slightly bigger or 30,000-foot perspective, Cleo, may I ask you to jump in? Given your expertise in financing, can we understand a little about some of those financing models that have worked in the sustainable and resilient food system space? Like, what works, and can you share some examples?
Yes. So what works is going from the enabling environment, the policy side, to creating bankable projects, and then to have the financing there. So one example that we really are proud of, and we're really grateful for the partnership with the government of the Philippines, is the reforms in rice. And before, there were restrictions on the import of rice instead of tariffs. So the price of rice was very high and the quality of rice was very low. But with the reform, which took, I think it was a dream for like 20, 30 years, we were able to convince the government work with the government with a $900 million policy loan to go into the project of having it more market-driven. And the price of rice, I think, went down about 30% on day one. So that incorporated with the roadmaps that were made and the infrastructure investment in irrigation, as well as on logistics that were made. Right now, the quality of rice in Philippines have gone up for domestic production, and even the import of rice have come up. And the imported price is so much, lower. And I think because to fight inflation and all of the uncertainties now, they're even cutting down on the import tariffs. So this is one financing modality where we dealt with the enabling environment, the policy side, and creating the bankable projects with the traders being able to get financing from the SME loans, and then to have the financing done, of course, with our financial intermediary loans as well. So all of those steps are necessary for this one kind of food system transformation.
Yeah, and I remember we were talking about a specific statistic that really stuck with me, which is when things work and these different building blocks come together, $1 invested in the food system yields?
So that's actually the statistics for nutrition.
Nutrition,
yes.
Yeah.
So $1 invested in nutrition yields $23 in GDP growth.
And a lot of that is because you're more productive and you're able to have better quality food. And so I think that point was really interesting, which is availability and accessibility and quality.
So one thing that we sometimes forget to stress is investment in food systems is actually investment in the most precious resource that we have. That's people. Because, if you prevent stunting, if you prevent malnutrition, you're going to have much more productive human beings and have the people reach optimize their maximum potential rather than will not be able to study at school because of their lack of nutrition they had in the first 1,000 days. So, I mean, for the growth of the nation, I think nutrition is extremely important, and the availability of food by the private sector is extremely important, because if it's not available, it's not done. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. Human capital, knowledge, and being able to invest in our people, and innovation, they're all so connected, which allows us to kind of also think a little bit ahead. When we think about innovations in food systems, Shengen, I'd love for you to jump in here.
Yeah.
What innovations, whether it's technological, others institutional, that you think are most required for us to be able to scale for inclusive and resilient food systems?
It seems to me right now we are at around a corner, a tip point on innovations. The AI, right?
Yeah.
AI is not just a buzzword. It really has real meaning. It can really transform our life, our science. For example, in terms of breeding, we know breeding goes through the traditional selection to hybrid, cross, then molecular, and then genetic. But today, version 5 is design of varieties. So you design the varieties with the traits you really want. Maybe, drought resistance, nutritious, healthy, and also low carbon. You have all these traits together. But what can you do? You use the digital tools. You use AI to select the genes from many different pools of resources. So here, I just wanted to mention the RISE, International Rice Research Institute, under the leadership of Dr. Yvonne Pinto. So RISE, so today's RISE, it's not just a high-yielding, nutritious rice, health function, so anti-cancer rice, and obviously vitamin A, let's say iron, zinc, rich rice, and even low-carbon rice. So through this digital AI technology, you can actually bring all these genes together and design the varieties you want. So that's the innovation part. But I want to go beyond just the technological innovations. Financial innovations, I think, clearly you mentioned about the finance. I think today, actually, we spend quite a bit of money on agriculture and food, but on wrong things, subsidizing water, electricity, fertilizers, instead of producing healthy, nutritious foods. So we need to look at a new financial model to make sure that governments spend more money on healthy, nutritious, sustainable, low-carbon food production, and bring private sectors together through blending financing or through impact investment. So innovation in financing is equally important. Now, obviously, innovations in even business practice. Again, through AI, through how you work together, and through innovations in our mind. If we don't change our mind, we still do the business as usual. We're not going to move very far away. For example, Andrew, you mentioned about our diets. What do we eat matters to our health, obviously. Overweight, obesity is a problem, but many countries still suffer from hunger and malnutrition. But also how we can eat sustainably. So when you eat, think about the consequences on the environment, on climate. Probably you will reduce the red meat consumption, increase your consumption of the plant-based foods, but in the meantime, does not sacrifice your taste. Again, the innovation will be so critical. I hope some of the chefs can really help to develop tasty, affordable, sustainable, healthy cuisines, like Australians or Chinese or Japanese foods we had yesterday.
Yeah, it's really critical that we don't think about the sustainability of our food system and the nourishing power as different things. They have to be integrated. And as you say, innovation really can be that link that helps us connect. And you also mentioned the private sector. So maybe, Christian, I could come to you, and then, of course, Andrea as well, in terms of what's the role you see or any examples you can share about innovation across the value chain.
I mean, a lot of examples that I can think of across what we have done with our business. I mean, I mentioned at the farm, the work we've done at the farm. And we brought in, again, very basic, it may sound, it's well before AI, but simple things like drip irrigation, automated plant transplanting systems, greenhouses where possible, better ways of using fertilizer, using solar where it is possible, and so on. And then transportation using crates, using coal transportation. But I'll give a very different, unusual example of innovation. So, one of the key challenges of minimizing waste is at the store level. And making sure as much of what is brought into the store is sold so that you reduce the waste. And we had a challenge with our display of fish in our stores. And this was a countrywide problem. Even our competitors have the problem where the fish stall used to have a stench coming out. Even though the fish was fresh, there was always a slight odor, bad odor coming from that. And that resulted in consumers not always consuming fish in the supermarkets. They would then go to a wet market or go somewhere closer to the source, and it wasn't the most productive thing, and certainly not the best thing for the fishermen. So how do we minimize that waste? So we grappled with this problem, and we realized that it was about having the optimum amount of ice in the display so that the fish was neither frozen nor had it thawed so much that it would smell. If you display frozen fish, then people don't like to buy it, they want to buy fresh fish. So you need to have the optimum amount of ice in the tray when you display it. And by doing that, the offtake of fish in the supermarkets increased significantly. So that was kind of a trial and error innovation that we did, which has helped, pricing and all that. So had a really profound impact down the supply chain.
And it's interesting, data and technology and other things can help us optimize, and that's the word you kept coming back to.
That's
in terms of what we're trying to solve for, minimizing waste, of course, and efficiencies across the supply chain. Andrea, can I ask you to jump into the conversation?
Yeah, another example of innovation or how you can use technologies, the platform to connect consumers and producers. This is something, of course, the traditional platform was, and in my opinion, still is the market. The farmers market still is the basic of our, should be at least, of our daily purchase of products. But of course, technology can be and is already an element to create new platforms where producers and consumers can meet, can exchange information, can understand better what they're doing and how to work together. So this is, for example, we started 3 years ago a collaboration in Saudi Arabia with the Ministry of Culture, and we are developing through a company whose core business is the creation of platform to map the local produce of the farms of the country and to share all the information to the consumers. So this is something that I would like to highlight.
Yeah, knowledge sharing is...
Knowledge sharing and not just the basic information of the product, of course the nutritional information, but also the cultural value. Because food is a challenge, is an opportunity, but also food is culture, and we have to consider that when we approach food on everyday life.
Yeah, that's important. It's such an emotional topic, whether it's on the production side, but particularly on the consumption side of the value chain as well. And speaking of like households or just thinking about it from a more local perspective, Cleo, can I ask you to jump in to just talk a little bit about this shift that we're seeing around local resilience? And there's a push for more or shorter supply chains, if you will, and particularly in Asia with the region being so interconnected, and how even individual countries' GDP and job creation and all those really critical indicators are dependent on abilities to connect with and trade with other partners. So can you share a little bit about any examples of either national or regional frameworks that have helped successfully balance some of these seemingly competitive priorities?
So with the challenges of climate change, already mentioned, I mean, there is a much more needed to concentrate, I mean, because supply chains can be disrupted. We need to have new supply chains as well, but the resilience of the supply chain depends on how the region can be integrated together so that challenges can be met together. So if there is a storm event or heat event in one area, there could be the logistic channels so that the right food gets to the right place at the right time. So regional cooperation initiatives that we support, like the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation, Glacier to Farms lady over there, and of course ASEAN, the Greater Mekong Corporations, I mean, they're all getting together to think about it on that level. And on the local side, of course, we're mentioning at the local food, local consumption, that's the most effective. And then because that also incorporates local culture. So how do we integrate that into a nutritious system? And if I could, the AI gets very important prominence in this because they can do the predictive models much more effectively than what we had before and faster. So if we're looking at climate change, weather events, how could we predict what should be produced and get the right kinds of seeds to the places before that climate change occurs and the seeds that you have now are no longer, well, bountiful as before. So putting all that together, and that's really, the discussions among these regional forums are really vibrant and important because it is neighbors helping neighbors. And I hope that we can have more of these collaborations as we change more challenges, but we discover more opportunities.
Yes, please.
Yeah, during my sort of first part of my career, I was educated on free trade, efficient trade. Brazilians produce soybean and export that to Europe, to China, to Asia for processing them as feed, then raise animals. And the meat will be distributed to citizens, in urban cities and in rural areas. So that trade was very efficient. But it has some problem. One is it has not taken into consideration of the environmental issues. Could you imagine every year more than 100 million tons of soybean are exported to China, to Japan, or to Europe? All these nutrients have never been come back to Brazil. Could you imagine after 50 years, there will be a sort of a nutrition depletion problem in Amazon, somewhere in the soil producing region. And all these nutritious sort of materials ended in China, Japan, or Europe. They have never come back. So that's one issue. Another issue is recent trade issues really increase the vulnerability of our food system. As I said, in many parts of the world, prices will go up, including in our region, Asia. Income will go down. So what will be a solution? One of the solutions is a local production, local consumption, or local food system. You try to circulate within a geographic region. In the case of China, usually one county. One county usually is around, let's say, 1,000 square kilometers. When you travel from the north to south, from east to west, usually within 1 hour. So then you circulate there, the animals' manures will be used as fertilizers for crop production. And crop production produces feed for animals. So you circulate in that geographic area. That does not mean totally free self-sufficiency. You still have to import, export. For example, in northern part of the world, we love to consume tropical fruits. Now we'll not be able to produce that. Or if we do, it's not very efficient. So, but the majority, or maybe 80%, is locally produced, locally consumed, locally circulated. That also helps to generate a local economy. Young people, I think in 2008, 2009 financial crisis, Asian financial crisis, you might remember that. Many people lost their jobs because of financial crisis. These rural migrants went back to the rural areas. You know what they do? They conduct agriculture because they still have a piece of land. They plant trees as part of buffer, as part of resilience. So local production, local consumption, local employment. And obviously, the whole community, the whole region will be very resilient against, climate shocks, trade shocks, or even health shocks. Don't forget the COVID-19, this totally disrupted the food supply chain. So I think today we needed to think of shortening food supply chain. The shortening means local community, local county, or at least local region.
Please.
If I may, since COVID was mentioned, what we were discussing before, what happened when our life were somehow shaken by COVID in lockdown? We looked back at our roots and therefore at food. First thing we all did, first was cooking more.
Yeah.
and I think it was good because it was also a way to reconnect to food. But after that, we start worrying about how we could get food. And we started looking at our local food system, looking at the producers of our area, starting connecting with them, start buying from them directly. And I think that this was an example on how we should more connect to local food system. And if that happened in time of crisis, we don't have to wait for another crisis to go back to that feeling as well. And in terms of local food system, it's very important also to connect the stakeholders of the local food system in order to have them learning one from another. That's why one of our most important jobs at Slow Food is to create an international network of local communities that can dialogue and understand the challenges that they're facing in different areas of the world, learn one from each other, and keep exchanging.
Yes, please,
No, just to add again on local food, again, in a tropical country like Sri Lanka, where the soil is fertile, there's plenty of rain, sunshine, there should be much more localized production, home gardening going on, home production going on. And again, something that we've done as the private sector is we've got the supermarkets, but also hotels in various locations in Sri Lanka. And we've worked with the local communities by providing them with a starter pack of seeds, fruits, vegetables, other plants, worked with other stakeholders who have educated the local communities on the use of these packs and how to best fertilize and so on. And we've also, where it's twofold, one is their home gardening can be for their own use, but we've also tried to procure, if you take our resort hotels, tried to procure within a 20-kilometer radius as much of our fruit and vegetable requirement to encourage this. And in a country like that, where really you have the conditions for home gardening and the land is available, it's something that the private sector can play a big role in encouraging.
May I play devil's advocate to some of this? I think that it's interesting that you said that we've got a local economy, but you also then look at the 20-kilometer radius to see. Is being able to produce and farm and sell locally, are we building or moving more into a siloed way of thinking of this? Or is it even possible to have enough food then to feed 10 billion by 2050 by focusing on a more local food system? Schengen, I might ask you to jump in first.
No, I think it's not really silos. We still work together. For example, sharing knowledge, we have mentioned that.
Right.
Sharing knowledge, sharing information, sharing the data. But in the meantime, we really wanted to avoid more carbon emissions. As you know, transporting food from one place to another involves lots of greenhouse gas emissions. And that pricing has never taken that into consideration. It's a huge cost over there. So that's why the hidden cost. And then we turn around, it's opportunity for local communities, right? And also, even for the local communities, that does not mean 100% so-called autarky or self-sufficiency. We still use trade to share with each other. But today, in some parts of the world, basically, we call it a large in, large out, in and out. And that system is very vulnerable. You know, any shocks, trade shocks, climate shocks, health shocks, will paralyze your system. But at the local, I mean, there are lots of sort of benefits we try to quantify in terms of soil, in terms of climate, let's say, greenhouse gas emission reduction, the economic benefits. So I think that's really great opportunity to really jumpstart the local economy. As you know, and not rural areas become sort of empty now. Because migration, because of the large imports are coming, whether it's feed, whether it's animal products. Yes, then you will see the divided even environmental sort of boundaries between rural and urban. Rural areas become empty, urban areas very crowded, and the pollution, the traffic. So we don't want to see that. I see it's a great opportunity to move towards that direction. So it's not silo. We still work together. We still, let's say, to share the data information, to encourage each other.
So it's a balance, you would say. Clear.
So, just thinking aloud.
Yes, please.
You know, as an ex-investment banker, I'm always thinking cost benefit.
Yes.
And then how is that related to affordability? Of course, if local production is cost effective, that's great. But then what you said about the total cost not being accounted for. Okay. If we don't talk about the total cost account, then we don't know the true cost of importing so much food and incurring all that degradation in the environment, so forth. So is there a solution in how we account for the total cost?
Yeah, well, in fact, to some extent, higher prices are not a bad thing. The higher prices of food, you actually encourage the production, right? The worst thing is very low, cheap, unsustainable food. Now the question is, when the food prices go up because they're produced locally, sustainably, by taking into consideration all these so-called externalities, I think there will be other social policies. For example, social protection. How do you make sure that the people at the bottom will be able to benefit from this transition? Social protection, let's say minimum income guarantee, and also food, I shouldn't say food subsidies, I think the so-called food distribution to vulnerable population like elderly. They don't have any, let's say, income, or they don't have any ability to afford, or disabled people. So I think the social protection has to make sure that everybody has access to healthy, nutritious food. This is basically human rights issues.
If I may on this, well, starting from the last point, I agree, and also we have to consider there are also some good examples of social protection done with food produced at local level by family farming, like in Brazil, the CONAB, Comisión Nacional de Abastecimiento, is like national. It's a part of the Ministry of Rural Development. Is buying millions of euros of products from local farmers to distribute to people that are more vulnerable. The other thing is that also, I think, related to what we were saying, the public sector should do its part. Because, of course, if the subsidies, if the support, if the all goes to the big industries or who's supporting industrial agriculture, of course, it's going to be cheaper what they produce. I think less than 5% of the PAC, the European new agricultural law, is dedicated to agroecological production, to biological production. So, of course, if local food producers, if family farmers are not supported, and if big companies, only big industrial production is supported, it's not a fair system, and this is something that can be addressed. Or another thing is like public procurement. one of the biggest challenges that I've seen everywhere in the world in my everyday work is public procurement in school. Why is it impossible to have local food in schools? It's almost impossible. There are some few examples, but this would be, for example, one of the first thing we should address. Why don't we work on that? Otherwise, it's very difficult for family farmers to have access, for example, to school canteens. Yes, we do gardens in schools, and we teach the kids the value of food. There's some experiment about having in the canteen, but when you arrive at the procurement level, it's almost impossible to have local food in schools. And this is one of the first things that, in my opinion, we should address.
I also wanted to mention the role of the food banks.
Yeah.
The food banks. The food banks basically try to, try to receive surplus food from the local food companies or food processing food, even farmers. So they have extra food they cannot sell. So then the food banks will be able to receive them and then redistribute them to the people in need. And every year, billions, so every day probably billions and billions of meals are served through the food banks. Brazil has pretty strong food banks, even US. Because of the recent economic slowing down. So the food banks, it's not the government, it's more like an NGO.
So it is about having the multi-stakeholder approach to solving some of these challenges, whether it's with the education, schools, or food banks to reduce food waste. Cleo and Krishnan, I feel like you want to jump in.
No, I was just thinking, 370 million people in Asia Pacific go hungry, go to sleep hungry every day. Right? 1.9 billion people don't have access to healthy foods. Right? It's an incredibly big problem. So, I mean, I think it has to be from an all-out solution. And I was just thinking, one of the things that you said, the foods are more expensive to produce locally, so you subsidize. Okay, you give social protection, and they go buy noodles, packaged, over-processed food, because that's the cheapest thing they can buy. So can we have policies, right, that would target more to having the right kinds of foods provided to or subsidized?
Right. Well, firstly, most of the poor and hungry people actually are smallholders. If we try to promote a local production, basically to increase their food production, so they can feed their family. For example, Krishna mentioned about a homestay or household garden. Yes, let's start with that. So majority of the poor actually are smallholders. Let them produce more, feed their own family. Then yes, some urban slums, they do have some sort of underserved population, food desert. Yes, absolutely. And you need a policy, you need the private sector, even the food banks, to be involved to make sure that the people in the urban slum will have access to healthy, nutritious foods, not just overly ultra-processed foods.
And there's a huge, our research has shown there's a huge implication of having cold chains as part of this, because in the underserved populations, if the first thing that's available is packaged foods, and that's cheaper, that's where it's going to go. And I guess whether it's governments, multilaterals, or private sectors, there's a huge role of the cold chain.
I think just on what I mentioned on home gardening, it's just a small part of the quantity that we procure. So it's not that it undermines or that you will do away with the trade system. So it's really the initiative of the private sector or even the consumers, the example of the school. You won't be procuring 100% or even 80% of your needs. It's just 10% and it's contributing to the local community. It's a socially responsible thing to do. So I don't think it should be a concern that you're undermining the trade systems. So.
And 80-20, I guess, 20%.
Oh, exactly.
However you want
something like that.
We've been having a really interesting conversation. I do want to open it up to the audience as well. We do have some handheld mics, so if anyone in the audience has questions, I'm going to do one quick rapid fire with the panel since I have them beholden to me. But please do raise your hands and we will get a mic. Give me 1 second before you ask your question. While I have you, last thought, rapid fire round. If there's one action either from your perspective, your stakeholder group, so private sector for you or multilaterals for you, or someone else needs to take in the next 12 months for us to be able to come back in the next year and say, this is what we've did and this is how we've held ourselves accountable. What would that be? So, Krishna, may I start with you? One action.
I think the biggest stakeholder here is the consumer, and that one action would be to educate the consumer on consuming in a sustainable manner.
Great. Cleo.
Well, from our side, I think it's governments have to have a nutrition, food security lens to view it as a growth issue, economic growth issue, rather than just a health issue.
Great. Andrea.
I'm going to say three, but very quick. Protecting and promoting biodiversity. We're losing 27,000 species, local species every year. So in the last hour, we lost 3 in average. So promoting local mapping and promoting biodiversity, educating consumer, I was saying, and advocacy with private and public sector.
Schengen.
Yeah, I think if we wanted to change the word consumer, the private sector, I think we have to change ourselves first. Firstly, I think our mind have to be changed from the old sort of efficiency, free trade, market perfection to resilience. Well, this is very much the topic of the discussion, focusing on nutrition, health, sustainability as a system to everybody. I think changing our mind before we change the whole world is so critical. So let's start from now, our research, our, let's say, project, ADB project, the private sector business, and your work on NGO. Let's think, how can we do things differently from now, from today?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We've got a very nice microcosm of different stakeholders here and also different perspectives in terms of individuals, consumers, governments, and of course, making sure that we think about the ecological system as well. All right. Please introduce yourself, and then if you have a directed question that's relevant to the conversation.
I'm Martin Lemoine. I'm head of agribusiness for ADB. And I have a question for Christian, just building on this. Modern retail has a great role for food security because it brings affordable food, a wide range of food to urban and rural areas. So it's very essential and underappreciated. But is there a role for modern retail to also educate and advise the consumers in choosing food that is more nutritious, have a lower carbon footprint or biodiversity footprint, is more local? So there could be an app, for example, where that guide the shopper to buy some, to inform the shopper what is healthier, more local, with less of a carbon footprint.
No, there is, I think, as I said, for me, the one key takeaway would be to educate consumers because they are the biggest stakeholder. And we have a very large footfall, obviously, into our supermarkets. And we have a big loyalty scheme, so we can use our app to promote and educate. But I think the best way to educate is through the in-store experience. And we were, as a supermarket chain, the first to introduce an organic section to our vegetables and fruits section in-store. And organic consumption in Sri Lanka at the time was negligible, but we took the gamble, if it were, to introduce a fairly large space. And by seeing that, we saw consumers purchasing more. So it's really the in-store experience that can be most effective from a modern retailer's, more than sending emails and using an app and SMSs. Do it through the in-store experience. And it can be good for business. It's not just a socially responsible thing. So.
Other questions? Yes, please, the gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. I'm Jayashree Priyalal from Uni Global Union. Thank you very much for the enlightened discussion. I think I would certainly support the initiative because if you really don't focus on the circular economy, our growth expectations will not reach the levels that we expect. And the immediately move that can only happen if you really stimulate the agriculture. So otherwise, there will be growth. It's not on the economy, only in debt levels. But the farmers and the poor people, they are also having difficulties because of debt. But if the companies, the private sector, can help them in finding markets and providing good food for the consumers, and that is the way forward to pick up and stimulate this growth. And one point, I'm based in Singapore, although we are not an agricultural country, but there is a lot of research when Shenzhen Fund mentioned about soya beans. The soya bean waste is been now used to produce a biostimulant.
Yeah.
And that is very effective, and it improves the soil conditions. So, so the waste will not go waste. We have to, the mindset change is the most important thing, and it's happening. And with the support of the private sector, this can be taken forward. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for sharing. Any other questions? I think we have a question there, Ravia, thank you. I think the point that was made around circular economy and also just generally thinking about our ecosystems as being regenerative, about regenerative farming quite a bit, is critical. But if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Peter Cleary. I'm based in the Irish Embassy in Rome, and I work on the multilateral side with the World Food Programme and FAO. Our history as human beings is that we respond to crisis. 1933, FDR got into the States and the New Deal came in. 2008, the financial crisis, we reconfigured our banking, etc., to adapt. And Gordon Brown, I suppose, if you look at the history, did an awful lot in Britain to reconfigure the European and American banking system. Come on to 2020, we have COVID, we reacted to that. The question I'm asking, which I don't expect an answer for, but is how do we create the urgency in the key policy makers? Because we're not daring to dream big enough or daring to do big enough to resolve these things, where everything I've heard here has been terrific. Ireland has an integrated plan for over 30 years. Every 5 years we update on agri-food, and our aim is to become a global leader in food transformation and sustainable food systems. But how do we influence, why do we have to wait for a crisis? Basically, and it's just something I'm pondering myself, and I don't know the answer, and I don't expect any magic bullet, but.
We do a lot of work on global food security. Ireland has actually topped our index quite a bit over the past 10 years. But I do think that the note, and I'd love to open it up to the panel, how do we create urgency without having to deal with a crisis? Shenkin, do you want to? Yeah.
Sure, I can start. I think Singapore and Ireland have done a very good job to really seize the crisis as an opportunity. We know Irish, suffered from great famine. But after that, the whole country will mobilize to produce more food, to eradicate hunger. But equally important, the island has been engaged with multinational systems to support them, to eradicate hunger globally. So, and then Singapore, Singapore imports most of the food from other countries. They see this as a risk. So what do? They begin to move towards vertical farming. They produce their vegetables through the greenhouses. In the meantime, they also innovate certain technologies to look for new proteins. Not just the soybean. Well, we can consume more soybeans directly, bean products, but also we can use soybean to produce so-called alternative proteins. We call it meat. Plant-based meat. Tastes like meat, but it's a plant-based. If you like to eat meat, fine. But alternative protein will give you much lower environmental footprints. That's, again, that's opportunity. I think right now, to be frank, we are facing a crisis, to be frank. Climate change, trade wars. We didn't mention about this today. Conflicts. Look at Pakistan and India now fighting a war. It's ongoing, and the health crisis, again, this is a probably time bomb. The avian influenza in US. That's why the egg prices are very high. So anything like this to really create an urgency for us to think very differently. Otherwise, we will repeat some of the mistakes we had in our history.
If I may also try to answer, as an organization of the civil society, we try to convey this message of urgency, but at the same time, it's always a struggle because you have to find a balance, because sometimes if you keep talking about urgency and crisis, and people may feel that it's too late. So while, for example, we work with private and public sector to try to change the policies, we also try to give inputs to the citizens, consumers, to take personal action that can have an impact.
Yeah.
It's a way to have them attached to something tangible, to have them feeling that they still can do something, but at the same time also working with let's say, public and private sector is it's crucial, it's necessary.
Yeah, it has to be changed at all levels, individual, household, of course, consumers generally, public, private sectors. Cleo?
Well, I think one important thing is measuring, accounting. Right now, we don't know what harm we're doing or how, well, our calorific intake is affecting. So, I mean, we do it with energy efficiency, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see the energy efficiency light bulb and you see figures right there. You see budgeting. You see the budgeting, how much of it goes to this subsidy and how that's going to be affecting. Can we have those measurements in terms of nutrition or food security?
Sustainability. Yeah.
I mean, how are we damaging our environment by these investments, by these methodologies of food production? If we know the numbers and if we know the accounting, I think we would be much more feeling urgent. And if we could educate that from like little tiny people in their elementary schools, maybe we can change the minds when they go to the supermarket and become actual consumers.
Yeah, I mean, not much to add to what the other panelists said. The only thing, developing policy is the easy part. The implementation is the difficult part. And like what one of my colleagues mentioned, I think if the policy is developed in a way where implementation is left largely to the private sector, where the policy enables something productive for the private sector, that's the best way of getting it implemented.
Great.
So just to leave it there.
That is an excellent way for us to wrap up. Thank you very much to our panelists for joining us today and sharing all these great insights. Thank you to the ADB, and thank you to you all for joining us today.